Shalom. Muslims all around the world recently celebrated the festival of Eid, which honors Abraham for his willingness to obey God's commandment to sacrifice his son Ishmael, who was destined to become the patriarch of the Arab people. Now, this week, we Jews read Parshat Vayeira, in which Abraham stood ready to sacrifice not Ishmael, but Isaac, the second patriarch of the Jewish people. The Torah informs us that it was Isaac that Abraham was willing to sacrifice. It was very specific. It said, your son, your only son, the son whom you love, Isaac. And it speaks of Isaac by name. While the Quran does not assign any name to the son in question, it was later Islamic commentators who assumed that the son was Ishmael, whom Abraham brought up to Mount Moriah as an offering to God. But in both traditions, both the Islamic and the Jewish tradition, God substitutes a ram to take the place of the child. The question that I want to discuss with you today is whether God actually commanded Abraham to sacrifice a son at all. Certainly, the biblical account indicates that Abraham at least thought God had commanded him to do so. But let's take a look at what it says in the Hebrew. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 2. Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ele v'ha'elohim nisa et Avraham vayomer alav Avraham vayomer hineni vayomer kach na et bincha et yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak v'lech lecha el eretz hamoria v'ha'alehu sham le'olah al achad heharim asher omar alecha. After these things, God tested Abraham, saying to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. God said, Take your son, your only one, the one you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. You may have noticed that this Torah portion is set in the context of God testing Abraham. But the Midrash questions the idea that God tested Abraham in this case. And the word in question is the word nisa, which is commonly and usually translated as test. Tested. It's in the past tense. It's from the word lenesot. But the Midrash associates this word with the word nes. You may know the word from Hanukkah, nes gadol haya sham. A great miracle happened there. But the word nes also has another meaning. It means a banner or a flag. The Midrash hints that God was not testing Abraham, but God wanted to elevate Abraham as one elevates a flag or a banner. But what about that phrase that we read, V'ha'alehu sham le'olam, and offer him, that is Isaac, up there as an offering? Now, yes, it is true that the word olah was the word that we used for a burnt offering. But the word olah has another meaning. It means that which rises up. Why was the word olah used to describe a burnt offering? Well, when you burn something, the smoke rises. But the Midrash points out that the Hebrew here makes a verb out of it, saying saying that you can read this as to raise him up or to elevate him up, him being Isaac, not to sacrifice him, but to raise him up. In a sense, God may have been commanding Abraham to elevate or perhaps dedicate his son to a higher sacred task. Now, if the Midrash is right, we ask ourselves, how could Abraham have got it so wrong? Well, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the great modern Orthodox thinker of the 20th century, brings our attention to another aspect of the story. As we read on a little further, we'll find that that there were two young men who accompanied Abraham and Isaac at least part way up the mountain. And Soloveitchik wants to know who these young men were. He points out that when Abraham sacrificed the ram that God had provided in place of Isaac, the text goes on to tell us that Abraham, not Abraham and Isaac, but Abraham alone, returned to the young men who were waiting for him halfway up the mountain. And Soloveitchik wants to know, who are these young men? He suggests that these two young men represent the nations of the world, the non-Jewish world, the contemporary culture and values in which Abraham lived. Abraham lived surrounded by non-Jewish people. Many of them were good people, and certainly Abraham must have learned a great deal from them, but nonetheless, they had some distorted beliefs and some very unacceptable, inhumane practices. For example, human sacrifices. And some of these distorted beliefs and practices, like human sacrifice, this idea that you serve God through human sacrifice, rubbed off on Abraham. But what does Abraham do? He walks up part way with the young men. He tells them to sit there. And he and his son go the rest of the way together. And as they get a little bit of distance, as they rise up toward God, so to speak, they gain clarity, especially with regard to how God should be served. A question that Soloveitchik takes up is, what happened to Isaac? Why didn't he return with Abraham to walk down the hill with the young man? Some commentators tell us that Isaac went off to a yeshiva to study Torah. And yeah, I want to laugh about that because there certainly weren't yeshivas back in those days, and the Torah would not be revealed to the Jewish people for a number of centuries. But what it is telling us is that Isaac, at least these commentators were telling us, is that Isaac took some time to learn about the foundational values of Judaism, what was acceptable and what was unacceptable to the Jewish conscience. Now, why did Abraham go back to be with these young men? He was already immersed in what would become Jewish values. And the fact that he goes back to these young men and walks down the mountainside with them, this teaches us that we Jews cannot and should not cut off ourselves from the non-Jewish world. There's much to be learned from non-Jewish Jews and non-Jewish sources. We Jews don't have a monopoly on the truth. The Talmud teaches us to accept the truth no matter what its source might be. The challenge we Jews face today and will face forever is to find ways to engage the world at large without losing our Jewish values, without losing our Jewish souls and our Jewish identity. Perhaps the lesson that the Midrash and Rabbi Soloveitchik are trying to teach us is that we need to be well versed in the spiritual teachings of Judaism before venturing out into the world. When we know who we are as Jews, we will know what elements of contemporary culture to adopt and what elements of contemporary culture to leave behind. Shabbat Shalom, and I hope that you will take the time to read this week's Torah portion and come to your own conclusions.
أبا الشمعون كن بعوني لا دعيتك عينني أبا الشمعون كن بعوني لا دعيتك عينني لا دعيتك نصب الليل عينني بالباكري لا دعيتك نصب الليل عينني بالباكري لا دعيتك